Hello and welcome back to Principles of Macroeconomics. I am your host, Dr. B. Happy to have all of you with us today as we talk about aggregate supply and demand. Supply and demand is a topic that we've been covering throughout this course as we've talked about the greater economy. So supply and demand, as you know, is a fundamental of everything that we do in economics. Talk about the goods being supplied and talk about the individuals demanding those goods. That's what we mean by supply and demand. And so we're going to explore the aggregate side of things today. Where are we in the classroom? You might be wondering. We are all the way down in week 14. I mean, it's week 14. This is technically a 16-week semester. Next week is our last week. Pretty close. Yeah. Next week is our last week. So amazing. We've gone through all this time already. So first and foremost, thank you to all of you for your excellent efforts throughout this course. I sincerely appreciate everything that you've been doing. This course officially ends at the end of next week. So we're pretty much at the end. Yep. So let's finish strong, okay? I need you to make sure that all of your work is completed for this entire course. Every single assignment should be done. We will have review for the final. Yes, we will do that next week. Excellent questions, Apora. Definitely, yes. Yeah, next week we'll have our last two chapters and we'll have a review for the final exam. Definitely. So stand by for that. So again, we're in week 14. Next week is our last week, and then we have the final exam. We're going to cover two chapters today, two chapters next week, plus the final exam review next week. And that'll wrap up the course. Any questions, comments, concerns? Okay, good. Let's go ahead and get started. Let's talk about aggregate supply and demand. Start from the beginning, and I'll do that fun little switcherooski. I'm going to touch on a lot of the important stuff, okay? Okay, the word aggregate. The word aggregate means additional. The word aggregate means additional. Aggregate, supply and demand. Okay. As you know, economic activity fluctuates all the time. It goes up, it goes down. Yeah, from year to year, typically. We have good years, we have not so great years. Yeah, it goes up, it goes down. When we're doing well, we have surpluses, we have a lot of economic activity. For example, this past quarter, past 3 months, we did real well. The economy did real well. 4% growth in the gross domestic product. Overall, 2023 was an okay year. We started off not so great, and then it got better toward the second half of the year. Yeah. Are we in a recession? No, we're not. It feels like it is because of the high interest rates, but no, we're doing all right. A recession is when there's 2 or more consecutive quarters in a year that experience loss in gross domestic product. That's the definition of a recession. Did we have any recently? Yes, we did. But they were so short-lived, most people didn't notice. So a recession is economic contraction, declining real income, and high unemployment rates. Those rules have kind of changed for 2023. 2023, we have very low unemployment rate. Very low. Some of the lowest we've ever had. The majority of people in the United States are working. Yes, absolutely. Incomes are rising. Yes, that's true. Those are true things for this year. So did we have recession? No, we really didn't. Did we have some economic contraction? Yes. Was it 2 or more consecutive quarters? Kind of. A depression is what the United States experienced back in the late 20s, when there was a stock market crash that led to 25% unemployment and severe inflation, high records of unemployment, and shrinking incomes. That was a depression. They're very rare. Sometimes they happen, sometimes they're very severe. 2008, you might think was a depression. It was close. It was a severe recession. A couple of economic indicators you need to be aware of that fluctuate, meaning go up and down all the time. Economic indicators are somewhat irregular and unpredictable. They're based off of the business life cycle. Businesses, as you know, have a life cycle that's based off of the 4 quarters out of the year. Some businesses are cyclical, meaning that they have really great months and then slow months. I think of retail is in this example. Retail does real well in the late third through the 4th quarter of the year. They do really well with sales. The 1st quarter of the year, a little bit slower. Yeah. So business life cycle based off of sales, when sales typically happen for the business. Macroeconomics, the quantities go up and down, as you know, with the supply side of things. Recessions are economic wide, where the entire gross domestic product falls below zero or loses from the previous quarter. It happens twice in a row. That's called a recession. Economic output comes down and unemployment rises as a result of economic fluctuations. Very, very common. We see this happen a lot in January, February, March, and then it goes back up, and it goes back down, fluctuates. Here's a nice graphical representation of the fluctuations throughout the years. When it comes to gross domestic product, we can see that we had a severe recession in 2008 to 2009 as a result of the housing collapse, so forth and so on. These red figures on the line graph represent times of recession. We can see that there is a strong correlation with those recessions when it comes to investment spending and unemployment. Investment spending goes way down during times of recession. Unemployment goes way up during times of recession. Let's see the relationship, right? There are a lot of variables that go into economic fluctuations in the short term. One of those being what we call the classical dichotomy. This is where there are two variables, the real variables and nominal variables. Real variables would be things like the unemployment rate, real interest rates, etc. Okay? The nominal things would be like changes in wages, those kinds of things. Yeah, nominal. We separate these into two different categories to understand the differences between the real variables and nominal variables. This gives us an idea in the short term if there is a recession by separating these two variables. When it comes to the money supply, changes in the money supply have an effect on the nominal variables but do not affect real variables. In other words, money supply is a nominal thing, okay? Just because the money supply goes down or goes up a little bit, it doesn't really have an impact on something like a recession. In the long run, however, money supply would have an effect. Absolutely. And the money supply would affect things like prices and nominal variables. It, however, would not affect the real gross domestic product, unemployment, or other real variables. In other words, money supply is a nominal variable. It has effects in the long run, does not have effects in the short run. In the short run, we look at things like monetary neutrality, where there is the assumption is no longer appropriate because in the short run, we know that the money supply is nominal. And when it comes to real and nominal variables, they are very much related in the short run. So changes in the money supply have a temporary effect on GDP in the short run, but do not have such effect in the long run. So when we look at the aggregate demand and supply model, I want you to remember that the word aggregate simply means additional, right? So based off of that definition, we look at the aggregate shifts in supply and demand based off of the additional. In other words, we look at the impact of supply and demand from the real and nominal variables. So for the aggregate demand curve, we look at the quantity of goods and services that the households, firms, and government customers abroad want to buy at each price level. Okay, this aggregate demand curve, like most demand curves, are downward sloping and to the right, which of course means that the supply curve is upward sloping and to the right, like most supply curves are. This, of course, the aggregate supply shows us the quantity of the goods and services demanded by the firms, by the individuals that the firms choose to produce and sell, and at each price level. It's upward sloping to the right. Here we see an example of the aggregate supply and demand curve. Of course, the point where the two intersect is known as the point of equilibrium. This is where the price and quantity supplied meet. Okay, so demand downward sloping to the right, supply upward sloping to the right, just like any other supply and demand curve looks. But again, we're looking at the impact of supply and demand based off of the real and nominal variables. That's why we call it aggregate. It's additional. Okay, so here's the definition of the aggregate demand curve. We have Y equals the wealth effect plus interest rate effect, changes in interest rate, plus government spending, plus the exchange rate effect. You'll notice that this demand curve definition, this formula, is extremely similar to the original demand curve formula. Remember, we talked about Y equals consumer spending plus investing plus government spending plus net exports. That was the original demand curve formula. But because we're talking about aggregate demand, which is the additional based off of the impact from real and nominal variables, we are substituting those variables based off of that information. So wealth effect plus interest rate effect plus the exchange rate effect plus government spending. So we can see that the variables were substituted for the real and nominal variables. The aggregate demand curve looking at the price levels and consumption which is also known as the wealth effect. This decreases the price levels. There's a decrease in the price levels when there's an increase in the real value of money, consumers are wealthier, there's an increase in consumer spending, and there's an increase in the quantity demanded of goods and services. Makes perfect sense. Price comes down when there's a greater supply of goods and services. Absolutely. At the investment level, which is also known as the interest rate effect, the prices will come down when there's a decrease in the interest rate. We as consumers know that based off of the current situation with the interest rates, right? When we see the interest rates come down next year, which I think that they will, you'll notice that the prices of goods that you normally buy will also come down. There's an increase in government spending on investment goods when there's a lower interest rate. Yeah, definitely. And there's an increase in the quantity demanded of goods and services. Absolutely. People will buy more when the price is lower. Looking at the exchange rate, when there's a decrease in the prices, there's typically a decrease in the interest rate. We know that part. The US dollar will depreciate in value, unfortunately, but that's, based off of the added quantity of the currency. There's a stimulation in US net exports, meaning there's more US exports. And there's an increase in the quantity demanded and supplied of goods and services. So in summary, when the price comes down, there's an increase of goods and services demanded for the obvious reason. Lower price makes you want more. Yeah, that means you have more buying power. And consumers wealthier, the interest rates go down, and there's a depreciation in the currency. The opposite, of course, is true. So when prices go up for goods and services, there's less demand for those goods and services. That's because the consumers have less buying power. Yeah, there's a higher interest rate typically, and there's a higher value in the currency. Yeah. These things relate to a rise in price. So looking at the aggregate demand curve, when there's a change in the price, we see the change in the quantity. Of course, price comes down, the demand for the quantity goes up. Absolutely. That's the best correlation. There might be a change or a shift in the aggregate demand curve when there's a change in things like consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports. Of course. When there's a change in the consumption, that means there's a change in how much people are willing to purchase at particular price points. This oftentimes leads to an increase in consumer spending when there's a shift to the right. The opposite is true when there's a shift to the left. When there's a change in investments, meaning how companies invest in buying goods and services for themselves to grow the company. An increase in this is a result of improved technology, better tax policy, and money supply. When there's an increase in investment, there's a shift in the demand curve to the right. When there's a decrease, it shifts to the left. When the government changes their purchase strategy based off of policy changes in the government spending at particular prices, something like building new roads, there's an increase in government purchases. That, of course, shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right. But, of course, the opposite can also be true. When policy changes for the worse, the shift will be to the left. And looking at net exports, when there's a change in exports, it oftentimes is a result of shifts in economic activity around the world. For example, a recession in Europe would lead to less exports from the United States to Europe and less exports coming from Europe. And of course, changes in exchange rates would also have such an impact. When there's an increase in net exports, the demand curve shifts to the right. When there's a decrease, it shifts to the left. In the long run, price levels do not affect determinants of GDP. Gross domestic product is only influenced on the short term. This will include things like labor, capital, and natural resources. Increased technology also has an impact on the price levels, but does not affect gross domestic product. In the short run, aggregate supply is upward sloping and to the right. Here we have a long run aggregate supply curve. We see it's straight up and down, vertical. Yeah? It's a vertical horizon in the long run. A change in the price does not affect gross domestic product in the long run. That's why we see the output level remaining the same. In the short run, it's downward sloping to the right. I'm sorry, upward sloping to the right. In the short run. Long run, vertical up and down. Short run, upward sloping to the right. Supply curve. We look at things like the natural level of output. This would be things like the production of goods and services and how efficient the market is running. When unemployment is at a normal rate, this can be achieved in the long run. There's a potential, the output potential increases when there's full employment. The long run aggregate supply curve might shift when there are changes in things that affect gross domestic product, like changes in labor, capital, natural resources, or changes in technology. Of course, affect things like efficiency that have an impact on output. When there are changes in labor, such as the amount of employees, and it increases, the aggregate supply curve shifts to the right. When there's a decrease, it shifts to the left. But notice how that anytime there's an increase, it shifts to the right. If there's a decrease, it shifts to the left. Very standard. When the natural rate of unemployment increases, there's a shift to the left. You see, so unemployment goes up, demand curve shifts to the left. I'm sorry, supply curve shifts to the left. Employment rises, shift to the right. Changes in capital. When the capital goes up, it shifts to the right. When it goes down, it shifts to the left. This is both physical and human capital. There's a change in natural resources, like the discovery of new rare earth minerals. The supply curve shifts to the right. Things like weather and availability of natural resources can affect changes in the natural resources, which will affect the supply curve. For example, when there's less drinking water available, supply curve will shift to the left. That's bad. Changes in technology. When technology improves through the use of things like artificial intelligence, there's a shift to the right. The opposite is also true. When there's less technology being used, there's a shift to the left. In the long run, growth in inflation, effect on the aggregate demand, and long-term aggregate supply curves shift to the right in most cases. Some things like technological progress, increases in the money supply. When the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right and the long-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right, it's oftentimes the result is continued growth in output and continuing inflation. Remember, not all inflation is bad. Steady, low inflation is a good thing. It's the drastic high stuff that we don't like. I think you all learned that this year, didn't we? As prices increase, we see a continuous shift in the aggregate demand to the right. The opposite is also true. When comes the aggregate supply curve upward sloping and to the right, in the short run, prices have a serious effect on the economy's output. As it shifts to the right, there's an increase in the overall level of prices in the economy, which leads to increased quantity of supplies of goods and services. When prices go down, this reduces the amount of goods and services available. Looking at it graphically, we see that the supply is high when the price is high. Supply is low when the price is low. Aggregate supply curve in the short run is based off of things like sticky wage theory, sticky price theory, and misperceptions theory. The word sticky, think of like the substance, yeah? Sticky substance. It's not that flexible. Okay? It's sticky, meaning it's pegged to something else, or that it is very closely related with another variable. Yeah, it's sticky, like a sticky substance thing. That if you think of that from that perspective, it means it's not very flexible and it's really closely related with something else. So, sticky wage theory. It's slow to adjust. Sticky. It's usually related to something else, yeah? Long-term contracts for workers and firms, it's sticky, okay? The wages can't change because you're locked into a year-long contract. They're slow to change. Wages are real slow to adapt to changing conditions, like the increase in the cost of living. Cost of living goes up, we see that the wages do not go up at the same rate. They're usually slow to respond. They're sticky. Nominal wages are based off the expected prices. They don't respond immediately when the actual prices change. Wages don't go up right away as a result of inflation or a result of increased prices. It takes time. If the price level is less than expected, companies produce less output. Makes sense. If the price didn't go up as much as I expected, I'm not going to produce more, right? The price of the goods are greater than expected, we're going to produce more of it. Absolutely. Prices of some goods and services are slow to adjust to economic conditions. We call these menu costs, the cost of adjusting the prices. Notice, like when you go somewhere and you notice the change in the price, it's usually a result of the increased cost to make that product, right? That's typically true, okay? It's it costs money to change those prices, yeah? Because we're constantly playing catch up as a result of changing economic conditions. We call those sticky prices. The last one's misconceptions. There's a change in overall prices. Oftentimes it leads to temporary changes that are abrupt and unnecessary. These temporary changes can lead to other issues like changes in individual markets and relative prices. Suppliers respond to the changes in price. They might supply more or less based off of the change in price. Absolutely. These are misperceptions. We think that the price went up, so we'll produce less. Did it? Did the price actually go up? Or was it temporary? Misperception. In looking at the aggregate supply curve, it's important to kind of understand this definition here. The quantity of the output supplied is the same as the natural level of output plus A. A stands for the actual price level minus the expected price level. It's the difference. Natural level of output plus the difference. Actual minus expected. Sometimes that difference can be negative. So what in your calculations as you're working through this kind of formula, it's important to understand that the A variable, actual minus expected, when you find that difference, it could be negative in some cases, which will of course change sign minus. Yeah. The short run, aggregate supply might shift as a result of changes in labor, capital, natural resources, and technological advances, like we talked about earlier. Expected price level increase, there's a shift to the left. When the expected price level decreases, there's a shift to the right. Why does the economy fluctuate from quarter to quarter? A couple of assumptions. The economy begins in the long run equilibrium. Remember, equilibrium is where the quantities supplied meets the demand, or demand and supply intersect. The long run equilibrium, I'm talking about the aggregate demand and the long run aggregate supply. We're looking at the intersection of where the natural level of the output quantity, yeah, and the actual price level intersect. Intersection of aggregate demand and the short-term aggregate supply is where the expected price level is equal to the actual price level. I'm going to show you what this looks like graphically. So here we have the long run. The long run represented by the vertical line in the middle of the supply and demand graph represents where the equilibrium price equals the natural level of output. That's the long run aggregate supply. In the short run aggregate supply, the equilibrium price is at the actual price. So there's a shift in the aggregate demand. In the short run, there's less supply and the prices go down. In the long run, there's a shift in the aggregate demand. Supply curve shifts to the right. The output is the natural level, meaning the quantity is at the natural level. And the price increases. So, in analyzing economic fluctuations, there are 4 steps involved. Number 1 is we got to figure out whether the events related to that shift in the supply, if it was just a shift in the supply or the demand or both. Number 2, we got to figure out the direction of which the supply curve shifted, or each curve shifted. To the left, to the right, what were the factors? Number 3, we try to graph it out, help us to make sense of it all. And number 4, we use a diagram, okay, to show the shifts. Here's what it looks like. Shift to the left, shift to the right. What was the cause? The change, the different price points, different supply points, map it out. So this is a graphical representation of looking at fluctuations in the economy. Remember, the word aggregate means additional change. Looking at gross domestic product, it's important to notice the red bar chart. The Great Depression, 1928 through 1933. You see what happened to the GDP. It dropped substantially, minus 25%. Very bad, very bad. And then World War II. World War II, we see a dramatic increase in the gross domestic product. End of World War II, it went back down, but then it came back up, and then it balanced out. In the long run, very little impact on GDP. Very little impact. GDP normally hovers around between 4% to 10%. That's the normal. Year to year, short-term fluctuations, yes. But in the long term, very stable. So again, these economic fluctuations, why do they happen? Looking at the shift in the aggregate supply. When there's an increase in production costs, they're going to produce less of it. There's a shift to the left. Okay? When there's a decrease in production costs, yeah, shift to the right. the short run, we might have what we call stagflation. This is where prices go up and there's lower production. In the long run, as long as the aggregate demand curve is held constant, there's a shift back to the right, the output equals natural levels, and the prices come down. We have the graphical representation of the adverse shift to the left for supply. There's a shift in the aggregate supply. Companies increase production costs, shift to the left, as we had mentioned. Short run, less output, increase prices. In the long run, natural level, prices increase, but slightly. That's what this looks like graphically. The comments, questions, or concerns about aggregate demand and supply. Aggregate demand and supply, we're okay. So maybe. You all still awake? All eating dinner? What's going on here? Been on mute the whole time? No. Any comments, questions, concerns? Okay? Yes?
Yeah, nothing so far.
Okay. Right, great. Let me stop this part of the recording and then we'll start the next chapter. Please stand by.